Of Glenwood and Lunt. We're here in the heart of Rogers Park, and we're up here on the stage at the Heartland Cafe, where every Saturday morning we bring you another edition of the Live from the Heartland show. I'm Michael James. I'm here with
Katie Hogan.
Good morning. And usually we hear a little Jimi Hendrix, but I think Jimmy's taking a sleep, and we're going to have some really live music a little bit later on. We're going to have Jeff
again with the live music on
Jeff Dale and
Live
Jeff
from the
Stone,
Heartland.
a couple of Southside bluesmen who emigrated out to L.A., and they're back here for Chicago Blues Fest weekend. They're going to play tonight, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the Artist on the Wall Festival this morning. Takes place this weekend. We've got Rosanna Magada this weekend. Oh, it's next weekend. Thanks for the correction. And we're going to start it off with our new pal, Gordon Mantler, who is...
One announcement before.
Oh, yeah, hold on.
There's because today is Trash to Treasure weekend, and that's the neighborhood swap, whereby you empty out your house of extraneous stuff, bring it to the Chicago Math and Science Academy, and then tomorrow, with your ticket that you get, you go and look at other people's stuff. So it's Trash to Treasure weekend. It is a really good opportunity for me to empty out my storage
Well,
unit.
we'll see how much emptying out you do.
Yes, we will.
Okay.
Yes, we will.
And we'd like to say hello to all the people in the house. We've got Hannah here. We've got a lot of people. David Orr, the county clerk, just walked in. And we've got a nice little scene going here at the Heartland. Many of you know that the Heartland has undergone a lot of remodeling lately. Some of you will be really blissed out to know there's a bunch of new bathrooms. The interior is painted, and the walls are adorned with beautiful photos by David Kogan, who is kind of a guru on the electoral operation, getting out the vote. He's active here in the 49th Ward, and he takes photographs, and he did a series of Sunday morning Rogers Park, so there's no people, but lots of distinctive colors and recognizable corners and streets and beach spots.
They're gorgeous. They're gorgeous. Thank you.
Okay, so enough of the prelims. We're going to the heavyweight fight right up. We've got Gordon Mantler. Gordon is a professor at Duke University in North Carolina, and we got a book of his called Power to the Poor, and it's about a black-brown coalition and the fight for economic justice. He's focusing 1960 to 74, includes the Poor People Campaign in Washington, which many of you need to know of. Good morning to you, Gordon.
Good morning, Mike.
Good morning, Gordon.
Katie. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And what possessed you to write such a neat book?
Well, I'm really interested in coalition more generally, coalition in the 21st century, but I'm an historian, and so I wanted to, put it into a historical perspective, particularly among African Americans and Mexican Americans. And when coalition, political, electoral, or otherwise works, and when it doesn't. And so I was looking around for a topic, and I came across the Poor People's Campaign, which I really didn't know much about as somebody who was just starting my PhD program and looking at the civil rights movement, and the Poor People's Campaign isn't really talked about very much. And it's overshadowed by Dr. King's assassination on April 4th, 68. It occurs for the several months after that, in May, June, July of 68, and really for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, his organization. It continues to be an organizing model for the next couple of years under the leadership of Ralph Abernathy. But what I think is really interesting about the Poor People's Campaign is it wasn't just about African Americans and whites and bringing them together in a traditional civil rights campaign, but it was also bringing Mexican Americans, Native Americans, Puerto Ricans into the fold, into a larger coalition to fight poverty, and really demanding a rededication of the war on poverty that had been really lost, had not been fought because of, among other things, the war in Vietnam and the amount of resources that the United States was dumping into Southeast Asia.
Well, it certainly brought back a lot of memories for me, and in the early 60s there was a book that Michael Harrington put out. Right. The Other America, and it was kind of the basis for the government's war on poverty. And I, as a young guy, was really in college, I remember being pretty appalled at the scope of poverty in the country, not only the civil rights abuses. And the war on poverty really captured my imagination and a lot of other people's. I did get to meet Michael Harrington, heard him speak, got to hang out with him a little bit. But poverty was a big issue back in those days, and you don't hear about it today. There certainly are many.
Which is amazing because there's many more poor today.
Yeah, now they talk about helping the middle class. Right. But what is the scope of poverty in America today?
Today? Well, I mean, I think, if we look at the poverty line, it's 15%, something like that. But as we know, and I don't think this is talked about very much in the mainstream media, is that the poverty line, of course, is artificially low. It's based upon, it's a very simple formula based upon food and the amount of, and food is actually cheaper now than it was then. It's a smaller percentage of a budget now than it was then.
I bet rent's higher though.
But no, housing's higher, energy is higher, medical costs are much higher, right? And so it actually, I would argue that, I don't know the figures, exactly, but poverty rates are in the 20s, creeping toward 30, and much higher in a lot of other places where there's high unemployment, where there's high foreclosure rates. So, yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point. Is that civil rights and anti-poverty activism and economic justice were, it wasn't civil rights and then we switched somehow to economic rights and economic justice in the mid to late 60s, which I think is the narrative that we often tell, that historians often tell about the 60s, and that they were always wedded together, and that grassroots activists, even before Michael Harrington's book, even before the war on poverty, were fighting a war on poverty. They just didn't call it that. And so, so I try to contextualize this war on poverty as not just something that government elites and academics were talking about starting in 61, 62 with the Kennedy administration and some other mainstream folks, but that this is what folks have been fighting for on the ground for generations.
I dare say we'll be fighting for many generations more to try to bring about some kind of a better deal.
Yeah.
Did you emphasize that part, like the movement program or platform, or were you? I didn't read your book, obviously, so I'm asking you about it. I try to usually, but I didn't this time. Or do you emphasize the Rainbow Coalition aspect? Do you emphasize the program or the people?
More the people. The program is there. I mean, you can't, and the program, as Mike said, captured the imagination for a lot of folks, right? And it was one way that people were able to engage with this in a particularly organized way. But I'm really interested in the black-brown aspect in particular, as well as the role that Native Americans, whites, Puerto Ricans contribute in this, and looking at how and under what circumstances do folks coalesce and build coalitions. And one of the arguments I make is that while poverty is something that brings folks together, fighting poverty, that different folks have different experiences and definitions of what their poverty is, and the solutions to poverty are what I would call justice. So the Mexican Americans who were coming from the Southwest, while they were interested in jobs, anti-poverty programming, better schools, they also were stressing land and treaty rights that are rooted in a very particular history and a very particular experience that goes back to the middle of the 19th century. And before, yeah. Exactly. And that was something that, while African Americans in the SCLC and other organizations were intrigued by, they didn't quite get, and it was often this land and treaty rights argument was sort of shunted to the side, especially when it came to the Poor People's Campaign and trying to focus on what are we going to, if we have only a couple issues to focus on, what are we going to do? And usually Mexican American issues of particular interest to them often fell to the wayside, much to their consternation. And that was part of the challenge and obstacle to sustained coalition building.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, when you talk about brown people in the coalition, you refer to the Southwest. So what was going on was Lopez Tijerina up in New Mexico in Tierra Maria. in my mind, while there were certainly Mexicans in Chicago, you didn't have the masses of massive Mexican migration that came probably after the Poor People's Convention. So, I mean, if you had, when we talk about Black, Brown, et cetera, coalition today, there certainly would be a much larger Latino base than there was then.
Yes.
Well, that's because the people who were here then of Mexican descent had been here since the 50s and before. They were moving on to middle classdom, and they were completely not relating to...
Well, some of them, but there was also the farm workers were starting to happen then. Certainly.
Again, the farm workers captured the imagination of people who had a principled movement head, but farm workers didn't compute to city people necessarily.
Not complete. I mean, Chicago is an interesting story because this is actually...
Cesar Chavez sat right there one day. I remember his blue eyes, which
asked
blew
me
my
to tape
mind.
about 100 jazz records for him.
But Chicago was one of the most successful boycott cities for a while.
Sure.
Particularly because the faith community and the labor community rallied around it. And I would also argue that, yes, there were middle-class Mexican Americans in this city and middle-class Puerto Ricans, but there was also a concentrated poor folks that lived in Pilsen and Little Village. And
the southeast side, too.
Yeah, right.
They had brought a lot of miners in from back in the old days, and the Silver Strikes had created a community on the southeast side.
Right.
Good history, Michael.
So there's definitely, I mean, there's four, I think, historically there's four concentrations of Mexican Americans in Chicago, and I think it's different today. But yes. Pilsen, of course, and Little Village, I think, are still the core and heart of that. And then, of course, there were the Puerto Ricans on the north side who had been who were fighting urban renewal, Cha-Cha Jimenez and the Young Lords. But there were Mexican Americans intermingled with them. You have to remember the Latin American Defense Organization in the late 60s and early 70s. Lado. Obed Lopez is of Mexican descent. Omar Lopez is of Mexican descent. And so there's a lot of folks who, even if they're of Mexican descent, right, that are part of the Young Lords, even if they're not the majority Latino ethnicity within that.
You also had, for a short time, a Brown Berets, which was started by a certain Alderman Solis, who later became kind of a revisionist, I would say.
But yeah. You could say that. There's a quote on your the book leaf that says that your book, Mantler, will completely change the way we think about the final years of the modern civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. What did Paul Ortiz mean by that when he wrote that?
Well, I think we usually, and I'm going to use an academic word here, periodize.
All right.
The civil rights.
Time out.
Sorry. Like a paradigm?
Yeah.
Are we talking silos, brands? Periodize. Is that P-E-R? A-D-I-Z-E?
Think of period and then add I-Z-E to it.
Oh,
and the idea
periodize.
No hay problema.
So when does the civil rights movement occur? Usually, in the public memory, it ends in 65 or 68, perhaps, because it's folks still want to conflate Dr. King's life with the movement. And of course, he didn't make the movement made him. And the grassroots activists and civil rights organizations and this kind of work continued well past 1968. The Poor People's Campaign just being one example of that. And of course, the book does go into the 1970s and some of the work of the short-lived Rainbow Coalition of Fred Hampton here in Chicago.
Good.
I mean, there's a lot of folks who, like Peggy Terry, who goes to poor people, who's involved with grassroots activism here through Join and other organizations in Chicago, goes to Washington.
We're talking close to home here.
Yes. And then comes back and continues work, right? And the Young Patriots, fall apart in the early 70s, but, they're partnering with the Young Lords, with the Panthers, and even after Fred Hampton's death, their efforts, I think that we have to be careful not to romanticize it. I mean, the police suppression and brutality in this city was pretty was pretty immense, and those kinds of efforts worked in the long run to really dampen the movement. But the bottom line is that the civil rights movement did not end with Dr. King's death and kept on going forward. And I think even though that might be a simple point, it's a point that we need to continue to make, especially in the public sphere.
I like to think we're still in a civil rights movement. We need to be.
Well, we need to be, for sure.
Let me ask you, Gordon, for everyone who tuned in late, we are talking with Gordon Mantler of Duke University. He wrote a great book called Power to the Poor, and it's about black-brown coalition building, focusing on the Poor People's Campaign back in 1968. I'm trying to, rack my brain here about that period of time, because we were still in Uptown enjoying, and I remember Peggy, Terry, and people going off to Washington. A couple of things. One of them would be the comparison to the bonus marches back in 1917, 18, around then.
Post-World War I.
When many veterans went to Washington, and they were actually driven out by, was it MacArthur?
MacArthur.
MacArthur drove them out. Not only was he in Korea, but he drove
burned the camps, actually. Yeah.
Soldiers out of D.C.
DC
looking
Mall.
for fair play and fair pay. But the other thing that just comes to mind is the Poor People's Campaign was about the same time the anti-Vietnam War movement was taking off.
Right.
And Dr. King certainly came out against the war at the speech at Riverside, and then when I actually spoke on the same podium at the old amphitheater, not the amphitheater, the Coliseum. And when he started talking about the Vietnam War, how much did the Vietnam War, the ascendancy of opposition to the war, play in the sort of fizzling out of the Poor People's Campaign?
The fizzling out of it? Well, I mean, I think that...
I just threw that in.
Yeah, okay.
That'll happen.
Good question. No, I mean, the opposition to the Vietnam War was central to the Poor People's Campaign's goals.
It was, too.
The American Friends Service Committee was a key partner, so, the activist wing of the Quakers, they were key partners in the campaign with SCLC. And, I mean, almost everybody there, I would argue, was against the war in some level. And we're connecting those two things. The amount of the resources that we were spending in Vietnam need to be spent at home. Now, the war did... there was a lot of question about emphasis. It's like, how much do we emphasize the war and how much do we emphasize other issues? And there were certainly old-time civil rights folks, from traditional civil rights circles, like Bayard Rustin, who was quite the defender of the war, in the sense that he did not want to completely destroy the relationship with the Johnson administration. I think that was inevitable anyhow. But Rustin is brought in briefly to try to organize the climactic rally of the Poor People's Campaign, Solidarity Day. But he held a press conference and said, here are the goals of the rally and the campaign. And Ralph Abernathy and Hosea Williams were like, what are you talking about? You weren't authorized to say these things. You've narrowed it down so much, and you don't mention the war at all. So there was a dust-up, and he resigned.
Dust-up. I love that. What a gentlemanly term.
So, a dust-up 2 days, a very public dust-up 2 days later. And what's interesting is when Rustin resigns, from this very brief role that he held in the campaign, the mass media, the mainstream media, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune's, of course, always against this because they were really right-wing at the time.
Still.
The LA Times, the Washington Post, all the editorial writers and the newspapers turned against the campaign and said, this campaign is hapless and completely disorganized, and having someone like Rustin would have brought it some prestige, but they fumbled that.
Interesting how they do that.
Yes.
Gordon, what would be the legacy of the Poor People's Campaign that younger activists should remember today and think about?
Yeah, good question. There's many. It didn't achieve the grand, policy objectives it wanted to. I mean, it didn't achieve a rededication of the war on poverty. And I think that so we can't make an argument that the campaign was some grand success, but it made a difference in a lot of individuals' lives. If anything, to get to get out of push them out of their comfort zone and meet people that they had never met before. I mean, for a lot of the Chicano activists that I spoke with and interviewed, they had really never met and gotten to know poor white folks, and they interacted with a lot of poor white folks from Appalachia in particular, and from uptown, here in Chicago, and it was really eye-opening to them. And they really so to be willing to go to these kinds of events and be part of this and interact with folks that are unlike them in some ways and realize that they have a lot more in common than they thought, right? And so, yeah, I think that's one of the great legacies. And the other thing I would say is that that consensus and coalition building requires making choices about what to agree to disagree on, and don't let some issues that you don't agree on undermine the larger goals and the larger work that you're doing. And so find common ground and build off
like
of that.
Like for today, the United Front against the right wing.
Right, exactly. A good example.
Yeah,
yes.
It's a rough one these days to keep it together.
This week, the United Front against people listening in on your phone calls or reading your emails.
Right.
Let me jump a little bit forward here.
Mm-hmm.
You and I spent a nice afternoon talking we were going to talk a little while. It was about 3 hours.
It was 3 hours.
And one of the things I think you disclosed to me is that you are here in Chicago from your home of North Carolina to research a book on the coalition, which was actually a black, brown, white coalition to elect Harold Washington.
Yes.
Would you like to share a little on that? Katie actually ran the Northside campaign for Harold, and David Orr, who's in the audience, was actually the mayor after Harold passed away.
Right.
So you're in the midst of some people who were in the thick of it.
Right.
And they're going to want to get your ear, and you're going to want to talk to them. But why don't you tell us what you're trying to do?
So it's very early on in the project, so that's one caveat I want to throw out
Fair
there.
enough.
But no, I'm really interested in the rise of Harold Washington and the coalitions that brought him to power. And I think that the story has usually been told as a political biography, and as really the climax of independent black political power in the city. And I think both of those are valid ways of going about it. But what was interesting to me is I did not know about the central role that Latinos played, that whites, both poorer whites as well as lakefront liberals played. And I'm really interested in how the work in the 70s, grassroots work, neighborhood activism, really laid the foundation and the groundwork for the '83 victory. Of course, he runs in 1977, perhaps as a protest, campaign more than anything else, but and gets shellacked. And so it's interesting to see that moment, and then 6 years later what happens. And a lot of it is not just part of it is that the machine loses a lot of credibility, but a lot of it also has to do with a lot of hard work, voter registration work, and a lot of work that's being done in the individual wards and precincts. And so that's the work. That's what I'm looking to do.
That's something we've done, I don't know, maybe a half a dozen shows on, that exact thing and how it came to be. And we're not going to be able to talk about it now because we've got this great show lined up behind you.
We have a couple more minutes, Kate.
But so
sock it to him.
When I was going to say that there was an in-between point, and I don't know again if you got to it in the book, and that was the election that threw Hanrahan out of office.
Right.
So that is there.
That is mentioned in there.
Okay.
Yes.
So that's your stepping point into the 70s for the Electoral Coalition.
It is. And I see, I do see that there is a difference between electoral coalition building and movement. Now, obviously the '83 campaign, especially in February, was, for Washington, had a movement quality to it.
No doubt.
Not unlike what we saw in 2008 for Obama in some ways.
No doubt.
But the bottom line is, getting your folks into office does not always. They don't always do what you want them to do after they get into office, and so I think
Ain't
that there's.
Ain't that the truth?
So
even when they want to.
Right.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, but I think that we do have longer conversations to have with this guy. So will you come back?
Well, speaking of
Absolutely.
longer conversations with Gordon, Gordon is going to be here at the Heartland Cafe tomorrow, June 9th. Sunday, 3 to 5, doing a reading from his book, and I think if we have the setup, we're going to do a PowerPoint. You got a bunch of stuff going on.
Yep.
And a number of
folks can come
people
out.
who you've talked to and known are going to show up. So I encourage everyone listening to the live show this morning to show up here at the Heartland tomorrow, 3 o'clock, for some real good information on Power to the Poor and the building of Black-Brown coalitions.
And that's from 3 to 5 tomorrow?
3 to 5 tomorrow, yeah.
Very good.
I'm so glad.
Any parting words of wisdom for those of us who are still like to think we're in the movement and moving forward, trying to alter the consciousness of those in power as well as inspire many others to push them?
Wow. Keep the fight up, and it really keep the fight up. It's really this work is rooted in your neighborhoods. And
let me ask you one other thing, because you are from North Carolina,
There we
and
go.
I do plan to have you for a couple more minutes. And one thing I would like to know is what's happening in North Carolina.
Well,
because you got a lot of Latinos moving in. You have whites of all political stripes. You have a large black community, and you have protests going on.
Yes. Well, we have the state is going through a very massive sort of demographic shift, and I think that one product of that was, of course, Obama's victory there in 2008 and a near win by losing by just a few percentage points in 2012. But we now have a veto-proof majority Republican legislature and a Republican governor for the first time together since the 19th century. And now, the Democrats that were in power were often pro-business Democrats, very moderate, center-right Democrats, but still very pro-education and had continue to believe in the investment that public education represented, whether it was the university system or K through 12. And now we're seeing massive cuts to education. We're seeing a rollback in environmental regulations, including a fast tracking of hydraulic fracturing, and things that, North Carolinians pride themselves on being the most progressive southern state. And while outside of the South that may seem that we don't seem all that progressive, we are in a lot of ways, but it's a very divided state. But the legislature isn't acting that way, and so now there's a real coalition that has emerged that is protesting outside the legislature every week. The NAACP is playing a lead role in that, but there's a lot of folks, and so there have been hundreds of arrests, thousands of people outside the legislative building every Monday on what they call Moral Mondays, and a lot of my if I wasn't in Chicago this week, I would have been there on Monday. So,
well, okay, let's have a big round of applause for Gordon Mantler. Thank you so much for coming on live from the Heartland. We'll see you tomorrow afternoon at the Heartland, and we're going to hear a little bit of music from either Jeff Dale or Jeff Stone or both. I'm not sure, but Lisa's going to play it, and we'll be right back with more Live from the Heartland. Stay tuned on the left end of your dial.
Awesome. Thank you.